Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're looking at this part 2 cue card. Describe a friend of yours who learned something without a teacher. You need to talk about who the friend is, what they learned, why they learned it, and whether it would have been easier to learn it from a teacher. Let's start with Finn's answer, in which he talks about his friend Alex teaching himself to play the guitar.
So, I've got to tell you about one of my absolute best friends, Alex. He's just one of those people who's incredibly independent. If he wants to learn something, he usually doesn't look for a teacher. He just tries to figure it out himself. And a perfect example of that is when he taught himself to play the guitar during our first year at uni. Alex has always been obsessed with rock and indie music. So, one day, totally on a whim, he bought this beaten up secondhand acoustic guitar from a classmate. At the start, he was completely out of his depth. He didn't even have the foggiest idea how to tune it. But instead of getting lessons, he decided to teach himself. He spent months watching YouTube tutorials, looking up chords, and practicing whenever he had some free time. The main reason he did it was simply because he loved music. He wanted to play some of his favorite songs himself. I remember hanging out in his dorm early on, and it was pretty rough. He'd play a chord, pause for a few seconds, and then fumble his way into the next one. But he kept at it, and after a few months, something seemed to click. He could play entire songs and even started writing a few of his own. Looking back, would it have been easier with a teacher? Probably, especially at first. A teacher could have corrected his technique and helped him avoid bad habits, so he might have progressed faster. Having said that, learning independently really suited him. He could work at his own pace and focus on music he genuinely enjoyed. So, while a teacher might have made the process easier, teaching himself made the achievement much more satisfying. He knew he'd earned that ability through his own effort, and I think that sense of achievement kept him motivated.
Great, so that was Finn's answer. Let's break down how his answer covers the 4 points on the cue card. Let's start with the first point. Who is the friend? Finn introduces Alex as one of his best friends and gives us a little insight into his personality. He's independent and likes figuring things out for himself. This also helps explain why he chose to learn without a teacher. Next, what did he learn? Alex taught himself to play the guitar during his first year at university. Finn adds some specific details about how he learned, including watching YouTube tutorials, looking up chords, and practicing in his spare time. For the third point, why did he learn it? Alex loved rock and indie music and wanted to be able to play some of his favourite songs himself. Finn develops this idea by describing how much Alex enjoyed music. Finally, would it have been easier with a teacher? Finn says probably yes, especially at the beginning. A teacher could have corrected Alex's technique and helped him avoid bad habits, allowing him to progress faster. But he then gives a contrasting idea. Learning independently suited Alex, and teaching himself made the achievement more satisfying. That balanced conclusion gives the answer a strong ending. So that's Finn's take on the prompt. Now let's hear a completely different story from Blondie.
I'd have to go with my best friend, Maya. We've known each other since high school, and she's always been the type of person who gets a random idea in her head and just runs with it. About 2 years ago, she decided to teach herself digital illustration and 2D animation completely from scratch. At the time, she was working a pretty dry administrative job, but she'd always loved visual storytelling and felt like she needed a creative outlet after work. Hiring a private tutor or enrolling in a formal design course was way out of her budget, and she couldn't commit to rigid class schedules anyway. So she basically turned the internet into her personal classroom. She started from total square one, learning software like Procreate and Adobe After Effects, entirely through free YouTube tutorials, online forums, and dissecting process videos from artists she admired on Instagram. Her room basically became a studio. Every evening after her shift, she'd spend hours practicing line work, studying frame-by-frame movement, and re-watching clips at half speed to figure out how certain visual effects were done. Looking back, would it have been easier to learn from a teacher? Technically, yes. A mentor could have pointed out her mistakes early on, given her structured assignments, and saved her from weeks of painful trial and error. But honestly, for Maya, I don't think a traditional teacher would have worked as well. The fact that she was in total control of her own learning kept her genuinely passionate. She wasn't grinding for a grade or following a rigid syllabus. She was just bringing her own ideas to life. That freedom gave her a level of intrinsic motivation that a structured course rarely provides. And today she actually takes on freelance illustration gigs on the side.
So that was Blondie's take on the prompt. Now let's break down how her story covers each of the 4 cue card points. For the first point, who is the friend? Blondie chooses her best friend Maya. She tells us they've known each other since high school and gives us a little insight into Maya's personality. She's spontaneous and tends to act on her ideas. Then we move on to what she learned. Maya taught herself digital illustration and 2D animation completely from scratch. And Blondie doesn't leave it there. She explains exactly how Maya learned. YouTube tutorials, online forums, and process videos from artists she admired. For the third point, why did she learn it? This is where the story becomes more interesting. Maya had a fairly boring administrative job and wanted something creative to do after work. There was also a practical reason. Private lessons and formal courses were too expensive, and she couldn't commit to fixed class schedules. So we have both a personal motivation and a practical reason. Finally, Blondie considers whether a teacher would have made things easier. Again, the answer is balanced. Yes, a mentor could have corrected her mistakes and given her more structure, but Blondie argues that Maya actually benefited from being in control of her own learning. And we get a nice outcome at the end. Maya now takes on freelance illustration work, so the story has a clear beginning, development, and result. So that's how Blondie develops her answer around the 4 cue card points. Now let's take a look at some useful vocabulary and expressions from both answers. Beaten up is a useful adjective for describing something that is old and visibly worn or damaged. For example, you might say, I used to have a beaten up old laptop that barely worked. Or if you're talking about transportation, my first car was a pretty beaten up second-hand vehicle. It's particularly useful when you're telling a story because it helps create a more vivid picture for the listener. If you're out of your depth, you're dealing with something that's beyond your current ability or experience. Imagine you're trying something for the first time and suddenly realize you have no idea what you're doing. You could say, when I tried repairing my bike myself, I was completely out of my depth. It's a very natural way to describe a difficult learning experience. The foggiest idea. This is an informal expression meaning that you don't know something at all. It's often used with, I don't have the foggiest idea. For example, I don't have the foggiest idea how my phone works. Or, when I first started cooking, I didn't have the foggiest idea what I was doing. It's quite conversational, so it's particularly useful in speaking. Figure something out is one of those expressions that's incredibly useful in everyday English. If you solve a problem yourself, you can say, I couldn't understand the software at first, but eventually I figured it out. Or if you're describing how you learned something, I didn't take any formal classes, I just watched videos and figured things out as I went. That's a very natural phrase for this particular cue card. Fumble suggests that you're struggling to do something smoothly. In Finn's story, Alex is learning guitar, so he plays one chord and struggles to move to the next one. You could also use it for other skills. When I first started speaking English, I was constantly fumbling my way through conversations. That's a great way to describe being inexperienced without simply saying, I was bad at it. Something clicked. This is another very natural expression. When something clicks, you suddenly understand it, or the skill suddenly starts to feel easier. For example, I struggled with mathematics for months, and then one day, something just clicked. Or, after enough practice, the pronunciation finally clicked for me. It's especially useful when you're describing progress. A creative outlet is an activity that allows you to express your creativity. It could be painting, photography, writing, music, cooking, or even making videos. For example, photography became a creative outlet for me during university. Or, I started learning the piano because I wanted a creative outlet outside my studies. This is a very useful phrase for topics about hobbies, free time, work-life balance, and personal development. If you start something from square one, you start from the very beginning. For example, I decided to learn Spanish from square one. Or, when I started photography, I was completely new to it, so I had to start from square one. It's a particularly useful expression when you're talking about learning a new skill. And that's it for today's lesson. Remember, focus on telling a clear story, developing your ideas, and using natural vocabulary. If you'd like more lessons like this, you can join our membership for extra lessons and speaking topics. Keep practicing, and I'll see you in the next one.